So welcome to today's session on mitigation and adaptation. It's great to have you here. I'm Co-Charlie Keeling Aho. I'm a senior advisor in the communications and engagement team, and I'll be taking us through the session today. But first, we have Bevan Hunter, who's principal advisor in our corporate services team. He's been working on our internal capability here at the Commission. We're really happy to have Bevan lead us into the session with a karakia. Kia ora, Bevan.
Kia ora, kia ora tātou. Ko tāku mahi e nei he karakia tīmata. E te matua i te rangi, manaki tia mātou i tēnei wā, a kona mātou kia mahitahi, kia tūkotahi tātou i tēnei wā. Ko koe hoki tō mātou kaiarahi i ngā wā katoa, āmini. So that translated, for those of us who speak English, that is, the Creator, bless us today and teach us to work together as one. You are our leader for now and for all time. Amen. Kia ora.
Kia ora, Bevan. Thank you. So to start us off, before I tell you a little bit more about what we've been up to here at the Commission, it'd be great if you could please write your name and the organisation or community you represent in the chat while I'm speaking, and let us know where you're joining from in Aotearoa. It's always great to see who we've got participating in these sessions since we can't see your faces. I'm sure those of you that have been on these sessions before will be familiar with this. Kia ora, Ben and Sarah. And Ricky, great to see all of you here today. So while you're doing that, I'll give you a quick update on what we've been up to here at the Commission. As you're all likely aware, especially those of you who've joined a lot of these sessions, like I just said, we released our draft advice outlining what Aotearoa could do to reach its climate targets on the 31st of January. And at 9 a.m. on the 1st of February, consultation on our draft advice opened to the public. So that means until the 14th of March, you're all welcome to make a submission and tell us what you think about our mahi. I'll post a link to the consultation page in the chat at the end of this session. It's important to remember we're open to changing our advice to reflect what we hear during this consultation period. So we're really keen to hear from you and are looking forward to finding out your thoughts on our advice. Today, you'll be hearing from our expert commissioner, Dr. Judy Lawrence, and our principal analysts, Karen Lavin and Sally Garden. We also have our senior analyst, Carly Sue, on hand to help answer your questions. The team will be taking us through the Commission's role in mitigation and adaptation, the mitigation adaptation link and how we've factored adaptation into our advice, and the role of local government in delivering our emissions budgets. After each section, you'll have the chance to ask questions on what you've heard or what you want to find out. You should see the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen where you can type your questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time to answer all the questions on the call, but Carly will try to jump in and answer some of your questions in writing if we aren't going to get to ask the panellists the questions live in the session. If you do want to speak to each other or share your thoughts, feel free to use the chat. It's always great to see the conversation that gets going during the sessions. So that's enough from me. I'll hand over to Judy, who'll be kicking us off, and thank you to Amy, who'll be helping us with the slides and technology today. Kia ora, Judy, thank you.
Thank you, Carly, and kia ora, everybody. And I'm going to just run through the role of the Commission in both mitigation and adaptation, and give you a bit of background about the linkages between the two. And Karen will take over and go through some detail and examples. So as you're all aware, the Commission has roles both in mitigation and adaptation, but the timing of these are set out in the legislation. And the first task was really to focus on the mitigation side, but not to forget that mitigation advice will affect the ability to adapt. So we've kept that front of mind as we've been working through developing the advice. So the first slide shows the 4 areas that we have developed advice. The first 3 emission budgets from 2022 to 35, and the direction of policy for government's emission reduction plan. And then thirdly, the consistency of the first NDC with staying below 1.5 degrees. And that's the national defined contribution that New Zealand makes internationally. The eventual reductions of biogenic methane, which might be required. So as some of you will be thinking about how did we actually go about doing this, and I just want to run through very quickly where we started. Of course, the targets in the legislation are driven by the science. And so the science provides the backdrop for our achievement of those targets. And so what we developed first were the long-term scenarios, various ways in which we might achieve the targets. And in doing that, we had to set up some sort of current policy reference to compare a bunch of scenarios against in terms of ambition. Is it fair and equitable with any of the impact, and how would the impacts be managed? Is it technically and economically feasible, which is a question defined in the legislation? And can it be achieved through policy? And so those were the sort of questions we asked ourselves within the context of the science as we were developing the budgets. So when we looked at what actions we can take domestically to reduce the emissions, and then we created detailed pathways to 2050. So what we've presented in the advice is only one way of reaching it. There are other scenarios that are presented, and those scenarios can be moved between depending on the evidence we get in our advice engagement. And so those were testing how quickly we could reduce emissions and in ways that would reach the targets. So our pathways allow us to really understand what the potential impacts are. And so that's a process of iteration as we looked at each of the potential pathways that we could take. So finally, our analysis of the science, the pathways, the impacts and the policies allowed us to make recommendations on the direction that the government might take in developing its emission reduction plan. So we're not developing the emissions reduction plan, but we're providing a steer as to how it may be done. And so if you have thoughts on other things that need to be included, well, we need to hear about those. So these are across the first 3 budget periods, and they will address issues particularly about how we can shift from BAU and move to changing our behaviour, our values over time, and the priorities needed by everyone and all sectors. So those were all issues that we considered as we went through this process. Our other role is in, and I think the next slide has this on it. So this was basically our mitigation strategy, the levels of the emission budgets, the advice on the policy direction. And our third activity is monitoring government progress towards meeting the budgets and the ETS settings. So our monitoring will enable updates to be made to the advice we give initially. And at each budget period as we move forward, if issues arise that need to be tweaked, we can change those budget trajectories in the second and third budget. And that will assist government in developing its emissions plan. So we're also obviously interested in how this all relates to adaptation. So while we have those 4 main mitigation goals, if we go to the next slide, with regard to adaptation, we are a monitor of what government is doing through its adaptation plan, which is the last bullet point on this slide. We're monitoring project progress and the effectiveness of the National Adaptation Plan as it's implemented, including how the barriers to implementation might be addressed. And so we can provide advice on this stuff as we go through watching how the adaptation plan is developed. And we will be setting out soon indicators that need to be measured for measuring the adaptation plan. And the Ministry for the Environment will be putting out this plan sometime this year in a draft form, as I understand it. And so any input to the Commission on how we might monitor that would be very useful. And this, of course, is based on the preparation of the first National Risk Assessment, which is already completed middle of last year. And in doing that risk assessment, we do it the second time, and that will be done at a defined point after the adaptation plan has been released. So it's a wee ways off, 2024, and when we have to start focusing on a second national risk assessment and revising or whatever the methodology for doing it, and actually getting it done. And the factors we have to take into account are those listed there, and they're very broad across economic, social, health, environmental, ecological, and cultural effects of climate change. Importantly, the distributional effects of climate change, and our obligations under international agreements. Under the Paris, we have to meet adaptation goals, which will be set out in the adaptation plan. And in developing the risk assessment, we need to consider international work, including the IPCC, and other relevant actions that need to be taken. So current effects and likely future effects of climate change, and for that, we will be drawing on scientific and technical advice to do that, and other factors that we think are relevant or appropriate. So we have a pretty broad remit in preparing the second national risk assessment in response to the adaptation plan. So I think that's the last one, but I just wanted to make some summary comments to lead into the next section, which Karen will go through. So what we do to reduce emissions is a contribution to the global mitigation effort, and to position New Zealand to be able to be ahead of the game and respond in an orderly fashion without too many major disruptions, but recognising that the impact of this effort will affect the global impact as we experience it later in the century. So the significance of that comment is that right now we are still really expecting what is in the pipeline. And so whatever we do in our emissions reduction is not going to make any difference to that. And so the adaptation burden has not yet peaked because of the emissions that are already in the atmosphere and the lag time in terms of affecting what we do. And these are what the National Adaptation Plan will need to focus on to effectively address the climate risks that have been identified in that first national risk assessment. And this also affects those reducing emissions in sectors, because they will both be adapting to the impacts and they will be mitigating. And so both of these issues are going to have to be considered in parallel as we move forward towards the middle of the century. So that's just a little bit of framing. And I think we're going to stop now and answer some questions before we move on to Karen.
Thank you, Judy. We've just had a couple through, so I'll ask those before we move on to Karen. I know we'll probably get quite a few more questions as we progress through. One of the questions we've had is, what will be the time frame and process for revising the national risk framework from the first assessment?
The time frame is in the legislation, and so it's every 6 years it will be updated. So it'll be 6 years from, I think, August last year, and then it will continue on ad infinitum.
Okay, we've just had one more through as well that I'll ask before we move on. The Paris Agreement isn't adequate in that it does not bring human impacts on marine sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Will you be giving advice to government about how the government should expand its scope of consideration of greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation?
Can you just repeat the first bit of that? So what's the bit that's missing? I didn't quite catch that.
It was the Paris Agreement isn't adequate in that it does not bring human impacts on marine sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Will you be giving advice to government about how the government should expand? Yeah.
So green sources, is that what it said?
Marine.
Oh,
sorry,
marine. Okay. Marine sources of greenhouse gases. Well, my understanding is that any source of greenhouse gas can be considered through that. That may be a technical question one of the staff can answer, but certainly the IPCC reports, which will help inform this process, are looking at marine sources of greenhouse gases. So I don't know whether one of the staff wants to add anything there online and just add in any more detail on that.
That's all good, Judy. We'll look into that. Thank you. Is Karen, if you're there, it'd be good to move on to your section now, and then we'll hopefully get a chance for some more questions later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks, Judy. And I'll just note I'm currently in Huntly in a car. We're on a road trip around the country talking to a number of people, so I hope there's not too much background noise. But kia ora koutou katoa, ko Karen Lavin aho. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about how we've factored in the link between mitigation and adaptation into our analysis on emissions budgets. And so you can see on the slide here, there are two different aspects to this and how we've factored it in. And I'll talk about each of those in turn, and really just want to emphasize we're keen to hear your feedback on this. We're out for consultation, and so your input on this would be greatly appreciated. So first, how contributing to reducing emissions affects our ability to adapt to the impacts of climate change. So as Judy said, at a global scale, the more we reduce emissions, the better our ability to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we've got some really good research on that internationally. The IPCC special report on 1.5 degrees was a very useful piece, and concluded that the climate risks would be significantly lower if warming was limited to 1.5 degrees rather than 2 degrees. So in a 2-degree world, we'd see higher sea level rise. There would be more species loss than at 1.5 degrees. Almost all of the world's coral reefs would be destroyed. And globally, hundreds of millions more people would be exposed to climate risks, including risks to health, water supply, food security, and economic growth. So sea level rise is a particularly important one in Aotearoa, with many of us living near the coast. We have about 140,000 buildings within 1.2 metres of the high tide mark. That's about $44 billion worth of value. In terms of local government infrastructure, there's about $5 billion worth exposed to 1 metre sea level rise. That includes 1,300 kilometres of road, waste and stormwater infrastructure, as well as other council amenities and assets. And there's 110 landfills across the country that are exposed to 50 centimetres of sea level rise. So there's a lot that we have located close to the coast. And also just to note that there are areas of cultural significance as well. There's risk to ancestral land, coastal marae and urapa as well. Outside of sea level rise, we're also experiencing warmer temperatures, droughts, the introduction of new pests and diseases, and that could impact on rural livelihoods, our indigenous biodiversity here in Aotearoa, and also disrupt practices, the cultural practices of whānau, hapu and iwi. So the costs and damages from delaying actions to reduce emissions are very real, and they aren't easy to factor in quantitatively. They depend not only on what action we take as a country, but the action that other countries take, as Judy said. So this is a case of all countries working together to reduce emissions. Assessing the damages of climate change is an evolving science, and we do make a few comments on that in our report. There are estimates available, particularly from integrated assessment modelling. However, there's also a growing body of research by the likes of the London School of Economics that show that those estimates significantly underestimate the damage that climate change will cause. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, because it's difficult to assess the most serious consequences of climate change. And that's because they're things that we haven't experienced before. So, for example, that's things like the destabilisation of the Greenland and the West Antarctic ice sheets, disruption to ocean circulation, biodiversity loss, and collapse of ecosystems. The other aspect of this is that there's also cascading impacts, which are also difficult to quantify. So, for example, the impacts of climate change on infrastructure and assets will have flow-on effects to communities and to the social and economic interactions of people within those communities. So it's also worth noting that there's a lot of work underway at the moment to build up a more of a bottom-up assessment of the damages associated with climate change. And New Zealand researchers are contributing to that as well. So there's been some really good work come out in the last few years on that, particularly around the risks of flooding and drought. While the science on damages is building, I think there's two really important things to note. So the first is that due to our historic emissions, there is some level of climate change that is baked in. And we're already seeing that as well. So the globe has already warmed by about 1 degree, and we've already seen about 20 centimetres of sea level rise. The second point is that the damages that we'll face from a changing climate provide further reason to act to reduce emissions. So the sooner that we do that as a globe, the less severe the impacts will be, and the better our ability to adapt to those impacts will be. Judy, I just wondered if you wanted to add anything on that before we move on to the second point there.
No, that's fine for the moment. We can answer questions.
Cool. So moving on to the second point there. There are a number of ways that a changing climate could affect our ability to reduce emissions. And so we've looked through that quite carefully as we've gone through our analysis, and particularly when we're looking at how to reduce emissions in each sector. So we look at things like the constraints, key risks and uncertainties, and then we consider if that needs to be factored in, if it's significant enough that it needs to be factored in within that the next 15 years, because we're looking at emissions budgets out to 2035. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples just to show you how we've factored it in, and we can always point you to where this information is in our report as well. So one example is changing rainfall and snowmelt patterns due to climate change. And that could impact the inflows into our hydro lakes, which are important for generating renewable electricity. And at the same time, changing rainfall patterns will also affect water storage and irrigation, and affect what we grow and where we grow it. But just focusing in a bit more on the hydro lakes, Aotearoa scientists have looked at how changing precipitation could impact hydro inflows. And what their analysis is showing is that we may start to see more pronounced seasonal patterns in the South Island in particular, with summer inflows reducing and winter inflows increasing. Overall, they're not expecting the water flowing into our hydro lakes to change significantly on an annual basis. So when we're looking at those first 3 budget periods out to 2035, as I just mentioned earlier, our analysis indicates that there's not going to be a significant difference in hydro inflows over that time. And so that's something that that we haven't had to factor into our analysis, but just being aware of that. Another aspect is heating and cooling of buildings and how that could change over time as the temperature rises. And that can affect our electricity demand over the course of the year. So at the moment, Aotearoa has a winter electricity peak, but it may be that over time, particularly in places like Northland and Auckland, that we may need to start cooling buildings in summer, and we might start to see a summer peak emerging. And again, that's something that's manageable. We just need to be prepared for it, and it's something that electricity generation companies think about day to day. When they generate electricity, they want to be able to sell it. So, so that one is manageable in our analysis. Another area that's really important for Aotearoa is the extent to which we use forests to offset our emissions. Decarbonising the economy has been a really big focus for us in our work, and it's actually one of our key principles that we've used to guide our analysis. And there are several reasons for that. So relying too heavily on forestry is likely to make maintaining net zero after 2050 challenging. So it would delay action on reducing gross emissions, it would lead to higher cumulative emissions, and it would put the burden of addressing gross emissions onto future generations, which is not something that we want to do. So in our analysis, we actually suggest more of a focus on native forests as they create more of an enduring carbon sink, while also delivering wider co-benefits as well, such as to biodiversity, soil health and water quality. The other angle to that is the risk to forests from a changing climate. Climate change exacerbates the risks of forest fires, heavy winds, droughts, pests and pathogens. So while trees sequester carbon dioxide as they grow, there is a question as to how permanently carbon stays stored in those trees. So those elements together have led to us putting a particular focus on decarbonising the economy. So I hope that helps to give a sense of how we've factored these things into our analysis. It's not always a quantitative approach that we take to factoring these things in. We tend to look at these things, get an assessment of how important they are and whether we need to look to how we factor them in quantitatively. But often it's not the case, particularly when we're looking over that shorter time period at this stage. So just to reiterate, our draft advice is out for consultation at the moment. We're really keen to hear your thoughts on this, and if you've got evidence to help input into this, it would be great to see that as well. Thanks very much, Charlie.
Thank you, Karen. That was great. We're getting lots of questions through now. Apologies if we don't get to some of the more technical ones. We are trying to respond in writing to as many as we can, but yeah, we'll just start with this one. We've got one from Scott Willis. Hi, Judy. Many thanks. Many emissions reduction policies can deliver greater adaptability, i.e. distributed and embedded renewable energy development. These are sweet spots. Is there anything you are focused on? Oh, you're just on mute, Judy, sorry.
Sorry. Thanks, Scott, for that question. I agree with you that this is you're thinking about the adaptability of the deployment of new technologies is a really important one. And considering embedded carbon is also another consideration that can be covered off in the advice. We haven't, I mean, the staff can correct me if I'm wrong here, but we haven't looked at all the embedded carbon in all the activities we have recommended. And if we need to hear about that, but some of this relates to how the carbon is counted under the international rules. So we have followed those. So Karen's nodding her head. So do you want to add anything, Karen?
Yeah, no, absolutely, that's correct. And consumption-based account, there's two ways that you can account for these things. One's production-based accounting, so that's the country that emits the emissions is responsible for reporting them, versus consumption-based, which is where they're consumed. And there's pros and cons of both ways. We do actually recommend in our advice that we stick with production-based. There are some real challenges with consumption-based, but at the same time, we also recognise the need to think about those embodied emissions, but just not necessarily through that particular accounting framework, so that they are very important.
Thank you both. We've got another one from Sarah Bogle. The first national risk assessment did not include cascading risks. Will the Commission's advice and measures seek to include these extended impacts prior to the next risk assessment? I wasn't sure if that was one for you, Judy, but obviously
yeah,
Karen,
it probably is. Yeah, thanks, Sarah, for that. I think the existing methodology was the first time it was put together in 2019 in a very short time frame, and the methodology for the risk assessment is going to have to be looked at as whether or not it's fit for purpose for the problem we're dealing with. And of course, cascading impacts are part of that. That work has not yet started, and we haven't yet programmed that in, and that will be a discussion we'll be having shortly, I hope. And because it'll be 5 years out, roughly, before we have to do that. And it's really important to go back and see what worked first time and develop something fit for purpose for what's happening in the world. So cascading impacts are, of course, an important component, but it's really tricky to do. and it needs some good minds, including a number of you on this call. Listen, could I just clarify a point? Luke Harrington's raised a question about the future warming being baked in. I was not talking about future warming. I was talking about the impacts are baked in, and in particular, the issue of sea level rise, where there is a lag in the warming of the ocean and the rising of the ocean. So we do have good evidence around that. The evidence around the baked in impacts is related to the fact that we're business as usual when nothing's happening, right? Nothing is being reduced yet. So if we bend the curve, we can get ahead of the impacts that we know are continuing to happen because we're not addressing those reductions. So I hope that covers your question, Luke. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I'll just ask one more before we move on to Sally's section, so we've got plenty of time for questions at the end. Judy actually touched on this a little bit earlier, but if Aotearoa meets the reductions recommended by the Climate Change Commission, to what extent could that lessen the adaptation burden, or is the degree of adaptation reliant on reduction in global emissions?
It was sort of what I was saying before Karen came on. You know, the answer is yes, we are very dependent on the rest of the world, everybody in the world reducing their emissions, because that will determine the level of adaptation that's required. However, we know that sea level rise is going to be affecting us in the near term because our people and infrastructure live near the coast, and the thresholds there are going to be met well before the end of the century. And those are the things that are needed to be addressed and planned for now, the things we do know about. So it's sort of a yes and a yes, but with a qualification. Certainly the international emissions are critical, and we have to play a part in that.
Thank you, Judy. That's great for clarifying. I'll hand over to Sally now for the final part of our presentation. So keep asking your questions. We'll hopefully get to quite a few at the end. Thank you, Sally.
Thanks, Charlie. Kia ora, everyone. My name is Sally Garden. I'm going to wrap up the presenting part of this webinar here by talking a little bit about the role of local government in both mitigation and adaptation, because this is really where the rubber hits the road for a lot of the things we're talking about that need to change to meet the emissions budgets, and on the adaptation side as well. And I note that there are quite a few participants in this webinar from local government. So in terms of adaptation, as I mentioned, local government is in the front line for a lot of this. As Karen mentioned in her piece earlier, there is an estimated $5.1 billion of local government infrastructure that's exposed to 1 metre of sea level rise. That includes roads, Three Waters infrastructure, parks, landfills, and other council-owned amenities. And there's going to be considerable costs associated with damage to that infrastructure as the impacts of climate change unfold, as well as with potential relocation and replacement of infrastructure in the future. And as well as risks to existing infrastructure, planning is another area where local government clearly has a huge role, including where development should and shouldn't take place, where critical infrastructure should be located, and in terms of what land uses happen where. And in terms of land uses, forestry is something we've been hearing a lot about in our engagement, including concern from a few quarters about the conversion of farms into permanent exotic forests in particular, and the impacts that could have on the communities. And afforestation is partly going to be driven by the emissions trading scheme. However, while the ETS affects how much land is likely to be planted in trees, it doesn't have an impact on where that might happen. So that's where council's role around land use comes in as well, and where they'll play an important role, and where resource management reform will also be important. And there's clearly a need for a resource management system that supports both adaptation and mitigation. That was acknowledged in the Randerson review of the resource management system. And I'm sure as many of you will be aware, the government just announced yesterday their planned approach to that review, which appears to be broadly in line with the Randerson review, including a separate Climate Change Adaptation Act to help councils with things like planning for managed retreat. Not a lot of detail yet, so we'll obviously be watching that space with a lot of interest. On the mitigation side, local government also has a very important role in terms of delivering the emissions reductions in the emissions budgets. And there are a few areas in our draft advice that are particularly relevant to local government, and we really welcome your feedback on these. I'm just going to briefly talk through a few of those recommendations in our policy direction that are of particular relevance to local government. So the first one is around policy alignment and funding. It's clearly very important that local and central government work in partnership to deliver emissions budgets and targets. A lot of this will need to be happening at the local level. So that alignment is clearly really important to deliver the outcomes we need. And alignment's needed across the Local Government Act, resource management legislation, including the upcoming reforms, the Building Act and Code, infrastructure plans. There's a lot of places where it's going to be really important to make sure there's policy alignment there. So in our draft advice, it's our enabling recommendation 4. We've recommended policy and legislation be aligned to enable local government to make effective decisions for mitigation and adaptation, and that funding and financing mechanisms are implemented to enable the emissions reduction plan to be implemented, and to address the distributional effects of policy changes that will be needed. And we have some milestones there that we would like to see as well. Another area of our recommendations that's really important is around transport and urban design. Clearly an area where local government is really key there. One aspect of that is integrated transport networks that reduce travel by private vehicles and increase other modes like walking and cycling and low emissions public transport. So this is covered in our recommendation, necessary action number 2, where we recommend that the government sets targets to increase low emissions forms of transport, support infrastructure by strengthening the direction of the government policy statement on land transport, and increase the share of funding available for investing in networks with low emissions forms of transport, and linking that funding with achieving the emissions budgets. And then another thing we've heard a lot about at the local level is the need to encourage local government to implement first and last kilometre solutions to transport networks. So it's getting you from your house to where the buses go from, for example, or to the train station. That's going to have a real impact on people's ability to really make use of public transport networks. Another area we touch on in our recommendations is around urban design, the way our towns and cities are designed. That's really important for how we get around, what energy we consume, how we manage our waste, for a whole host of areas. There have been some studies on the impact of urban form, density and mobility, land use and planning, the impact they have on emissions, but it's been quite challenging to find really robust quantitative evidence on this. And we're really keen to explore this area a little bit more. And we know a lot of councils are really keen to talk to us more about that, what we could say in this space. The way cities are designed is also, of course, really important from an adaptation perspective. Not increasing exposure to the physical impacts of climate change. So not building in low-lying areas, not putting your critical infrastructure in places where it's going to be damaged as sea levels rise, for example. So those two are really interconnected there in urban form, both mitigation and adaptation side. In our recommendation, necessary action 10, we recommend that the government promotes the evolution of urban form to enable low emissions transport and building, including through ongoing legislative reform. We know that that's an area where we do need more in-depth investigation, and we're really keen to hear your perspectives on that through your submissions and conversations. And we're hoping to have a targeted session with councils in the near future to talk through a number of topics, including this one. And the final thing I'm just going to touch on that's of particular relevance to local councils from both an adaptation and mitigation perspective is around waste management, because obviously councils are the owners and operators of a lot of landfills in New Zealand, and our recommendation focuses on the government setting targets in the New Zealand waste strategy for waste reduction, recovery and landfill gas capture to reduce waste emissions. We're really lacking in data around waste at the moment, so there's really a need for better data collection, because that will really help in identifying opportunities to mitigate emissions from waste. And the strong adaptation link here, really, because we know that there are a lot of landfills in New Zealand that are exposed to really small amounts of sea level rise. There are 110 open and closed landfill sites across the country that are exposed to 50 centimetres of sea level rise. And what we saw happen recently with the Fox River landfill on the west coast really highlights the risks that pose. So I'm just going to finish off there and hand back to Charlie, who will manage some more questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Sally. That was great. We've got quite a lot coming through now, so I'll just have a look which ones to start us off with. We've got one here from Anne Smith. This one might be one for you, Sally. It might be for Judy. We'll just see. I'm interested in examples of the factors that could result in increases in emissions. For example, could we lose soil carbon after severe drought incidents?
The answer is yes.
That one's easy.
This came up in the discussion yesterday, the agriculture and forestry discussion, and certainly, New Zealand has reasonably high carbon content in its soils, and so the issue for us is to make sure that those soils stay in place, and that the carbon isn't lost through drought, or the flip side, through heavy rainfall events. And of course, that's been an issue ever since we cleared our native forests. Mm-hmm. So the policies around that would need to be focused specifically on sustainable practices.
And I'll just to add to that, Judy, we do get quite a few questions about soil carbon and whether that should be something that we include as a specific mitigation measure to count towards our budgets. At the moment, it's really hard to measure and monitor soil carbon. We absolutely know that increasing soil carbon is a good thing. We know there are large risks associated with losing soil carbon through things like drought, as you note, but it's an area that we know there's a lot of interest in, and where we're definitely keen for more information about the potential to monitor, measure and manage it.
Thanks, Sally. And we've got another one here for you, actually, from Terry. Sally, is now the time to submit input on the topic of local government plans for adaptation, or should we limit it to mitigation and emissions budgets only in this round?
Well, this round of submissions is really focused on submissions relating to our first package of advice, which, as Judy explained in her section there at the beginning, is really focused on mitigation. That's the task at hand right now. Having said that, we're really keen to hear everything you have to tell us that you think we should be looking at. And as Karen went through in her session, the links between mitigation and adaptation are many and varied, and you can't look at the two in isolation. So while we're very focused on wanting submissions that relate to this first package of advice, we want to make sure that we're keeping those linkages in mind. So keen to hear everything you have to tell us.
Thank you, Sally. I think this one might be for you, Judy. Given the IPCC will issue their 6th assessment report next year, are you advising government to fund any required update of New Zealand regional models so the quality of risk assessments and adaptation responses is improved?
Yeah, there are some recommendations in the report relating to research, and this particular issue hasn't been flagged specifically. There will be a number of areas across that when the 6th assessment report comes out, which won't probably be until 2022 for the working group 2. And I declare an interest because I'm a coordinating lead author. And we actually don't know the timetable of that at the moment because of COVID. But it is likely to be 2022, probably the first half of that year. yet to be confirmed. But in terms of updating models that can help with the adaptation process, certainly if you've got thoughts about that, we'd like to hear about them, because we do need to get prepared for this ahead of, as I said, we need to get ahead of the activity which will stretch the Commission enormously coming up in 2025. So the more we can front end it, the things and the methodology that need to be done, and I think there were some other questions about that, that the methodology for the risk assessment will need to be updated and so forth. So, but we haven't actually recommended that. But if you've got some suggestions as to what is needed, that would be extremely useful. There is another area of research that Sarah Michelov-Fletcher's raised, which I just comment on, just while we're on research. Have we thought about climate change might impact native and exotic forests differently? We have asked that question, and we would welcome more research in that area to better understand the impacts of climate change on the differences, if you like, between exotics and native vegetation, because that is an important part of our shift that we're seeing in the forestry recommendations. Yeah, so thanks for that, Sarah.
Thank you, Judy. We've got one here from Catherine. It's quite a long one, so I'm just going to read the first part of it. I think this will be one for you, Sally. The ECO fully supports the Commission promoting more native forests, but why is there so much emphasis on planting rather than helping with forest regeneration? For example, fencing, weed control, etc. And why is there so little emphasis on mangroves, wetlands and tussock grasslands?
And thanks, Kath, for that question. Yes, it is something we've been hearing quite a bit, actually, is that the emphasis on expanding native forestry, speaking mostly about planting rather than regeneration. Absolutely, there are large parts of the country where native regeneration will be absolutely an option, and the things that are preventing that from happening at the moment are things like the cost of fencing, the cost of pest control, maintaining the carbon stocks in that forest in the long term. So that's something we're really interested in, looking at what incentives there could be for encouraging regeneration. There are other parts of the country where planting may need to happen, but there are definitely many places where we're looking at regeneration, and that will be fantastic. And we'd really be keen to hear people's thoughts on how that can be encouraged. In terms of, sorry, I should have written down the second part of that question, but why not looking at mangroves and tussock and other forms of wetlands? Yeah, so we do have a recommendation in there looking at that the governments have developed ways of measuring and monitoring small areas of vegetation. So, for example, on farms with the small pockets of native bush, riparian planting, things like that, we know they have huge benefit. In terms of some of the things like mangroves and wetlands and things like that, the real carbon benefit from wetlands is in not just destroying them in the first place. It's the carbon that is sequestered in the soils there, and that's something that's very much on our minds as something that is worthwhile encouraging. In some of these different land uses, we just don't have a lot of really robust quantitative information about the measuring, the monitoring of what exactly the emissions are and the opportunities for increasing them. So for some of them, it's an information issue, but it's something we're really keen to keep working on, and keen to see any evidence or information you think we should be looking at to say more in that space. Judy might have something to add there.
Sorry, I'll just add, I think we're very well served in the tussock grasslands area through work done at Otago University particularly. We're aware of that, and there are issues about the impacts of land use change, particularly exotic forestry, and the impacts on tussock grasslands. So those interactions between land use change and emissions reduction and adaptation are critical to our advice. And as Sally has said, there are some areas where we don't have as good information as others, but there's a lot going on in the wetlands area that we're aware of, and we're keen to see those encouraged. And also the blue carbon issue with mangroves being continued to be protected and rather than pulled out. So Auckland, keep your mangroves. And that's about people's attitudes. You know, how do we change behaviours? How do Auckland people look at the value of mangroves? You know, there's some really big questions in there to get some of the stuff accepted. And anyway, those are things that are on our radar.
Thank you, Judy. That was great. And Sally, good answers. And we've got one more here from Sophie, Sophie McKins. Small councils struggle with resourcing staff, etc., to deal with climate change needs, and long-term plans are going out for consultation in the next few weeks. Many also have district plan reviews underway. Will the Climate Change Commission be submitting, since central government is unlikely to change legislation before these 10-year plans are confirmed?
Maybe I could comment on that. We haven't yet discussed that as a board, except to say that we did make a submission on the changes that affected the RMA as a result of the COVID situation. And we're very much aware that this institutional issue really needs to be addressed. And I think that the question will be rather more, how are we going to interact with the changes to the RMA? And that has yet to be decided. But certainly, because our act's being suggested to be revised, we will be having something to say, but yet to be discussed.
Just a small thing to add to that too. We're really aware of the challenges councils face in this area. There's a huge amount of work that is happening and needs to happen, and councils are hugely constrained in their resources to deal with it. And as I mentioned earlier, we have made a recommendation around the need for policy alignment and funding to help enable councils to deliver both on the mitigation and adaptation side of their responsibilities. It's something we're very aware of with those constraints.
Thank you both. We might have time for one, maybe two more. We'll see how we get on. But one here from Olaf. What will the Climate Change Commission? What role will the Climate Change Commission play in relation to the Adaptation Act? What is the timing on that, and should it be a higher priority?
Again, Olaf, we haven't yet discussed that. It was announced yesterday. But certainly we will be involved in that process in some way, and you can see the timing that was put out by the Minister yesterday. So it is on our radar.
Thank you, Judy. I think we'll wrap up in a second, unless either of you have any closing comments. We will shortly hand over to Bevan for the karakia. But I just want to say thank you to everyone who's been on the session today. It's been really great to hear from you all, and we've seen some really detailed questions coming through. So we hope you've learned a lot from the discussion. I'll just share a link before we go to the consultation website in the chat. Just as I said before, we'd really love to hear from you and hear what you think about our recommendations, and this is your opportunity to tell us what you think. And we will be running more of these sessions, so keep an eye out on our website and social media channels. I'll also share a link to our events page in the chat shortly. But Bevan, if you're there, I'm just going to ask you if you could see us out with a karakia.
Kia ora tātou. Okay then. Well, as my colleague said, thanks for everybody who's participated. Tēnā koutou mō koutou awhina, I tuku a mai, hei tautoko I tā tātou hui me te kaupapa nei, ana hi karakia whakamutunga. Kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o tō tātou ariki a ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua, me te whiwhinga tahitanga o te wairua tapu, āki āmini. Thank you.